Hey everybody, this is a piece from the Trotsky Reappraisal, edited by Terry Brotherstone and Paul Dukes. This piece is actually titled, what is it titled? Let's find out, that's important. Trotsky, October and Its Perspective by V.P. Buldakov. Where am I? Come on. V.P. Buldakov is Vice Chair, Department of the History of Revolutions in Russia of the Academy of Sciences in Moscow. I should probably say it Moscow. I think that's a proper, correct way. To discuss his, to pronounce Moscow. It's Moscow. Okay. Sorry for this awkward mouth slop that I've been engaging in for the past 30 seconds. Here we go. Starts with a footnote, so let's see what this footnote has to tell us. Footnote says, a few minor editorial cuts have been made, mainly through reducing the length of some quotations. In Buldakov's typescript, Trotsky's, quote, testament is more fully quoted in his first few paragraphs. It can be read in full in Sarah Lovell's edited volume, Leon Trotsky Speaks, published in New York in 1972. It's probably a Pathfinder book, I would imagine. Let's see. I don't have the information on this page, but it says major political questions of the 20th century discussed by an outstanding communist leader include the defense of the right to revolution, made in 1906 in the prisoner's dock of the Tsarist courts, speeches as a leader of the revolutionary government following the Bolshevik-led revolution, and I Stake My Life, Trotsky's 1937 defense of his 20-year Bolshevik course and challenge to the organizers of Joseph Stalin's frame-up trials. And that was originally published by Pathfinder. Anyway, end footnote. If you aren't familiar with my videos at all, if this is the first one you read, I often look things up, and I also look up books that are cited in the footnotes. Trotsky's well-known testament, written about 6 months before his assassination, concludes thus, quote, whatever the circumstances of my death, I shall die with unshaken faith in the communist future. This faith in man and in his future gives me even now such power of resistance as cannot be given by any religion. End quote. Trotsky. These words clarify much about Trotsky's personality and about the revolution Trotsky represented. They ring out like a condemnation of that epoch which reduced the humanistic ideal to deadly class intolerance and readiness in the name of, quote, love for an abstract future humanity to crush everything that actually exists. Trotsky was not at all a fanatic in the traditional historical sense of the word. Trotsky's faith was in those days called science. The contradiction between humanity and worship of progress is basic to Trotsky's personal drama, which expresses, in a way, the tragedy of the Russian Revolution as a whole. Few, alas, in present-day Soviet historiography appreciate this. More than 5 years of perestroika did not bring the public rehabilitation of Trotsky. This was not understood in the West. Robin Blackburn, for one, misrepresented the situation when, in the Independent magazine, on the 19th of August 1990, Robin Blackburn implied that Trotsky's works were being published uninterruptedly, and interest in Trotsky was at a high level. Interest in Trotsky was actively hostile. The lefts, the quote, Democrats, proclaimed him Stalin's precursor, while the rights, the quote, patriots, were disposed to see him as the central figure in a quote, Zionist conspiracy, end quote, against Russia. Such were the grimaces of perestroika, which, though intended to strengthen the socialist ideal, turned out to be hostile to that ideal. Under these conditions, Trotsky still remained incomprehensible to the masses who, disappointed in their expectations of a trough filled with plenty called, quote, communism, had sunk into senseless defamation of the October Revolution. The situation was made worse by the fact that in the forefront of the work undertaken to explain Trotsky stood persons thoroughly unqualified for the task. N.A. Vesetsky transformed himself from a, quote, exposer of Trotskyism into a, quote, expert on Trotskyism, and Colonel General of Philosophy D.A. Volkogonov revealed a unique capacity for writing about Stalin with his right hand and about Trotsky with his left. I don't know if any of these people come up, since the author of this work did not come up. Looks like there's a review of Vesetsky's book by Ian D. Thatcher. I don't see any description. Dmitry Volkogonov lived from 1928 to 1995 and was a Soviet and Russian historian and colonel general who was head of the Soviet military's psychological warfare department. After research in secret Soviet archives, both before and after the dissolution of the Union, he published a biography of Joseph Stalin and Vladimir Lenin, among others such as Leon Trotsky. Despite being a committed Stalinist and Marxist-Leninist for most of his career, Volkogonov came to repudiate communism and the Soviet system within the last decade of his life before his death from cancer in 1995. Through his research in the restricted archives of the Soviet Central Committee, Volkogonov discovered facts that contradicted the official Soviet version of events and the cult of personality that had been built up around Lenin and Stalin. Volkogonov published books that contributed to the strain of liberal Russian thought that emerged during Glasnost in the late 1980s and the post-Soviet era of the 1990s. Where am I? This is quite a long Wikipedia, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. Back to the text, D.A. Volkogonov even publicly stated that if Trotsky had come to power, he would have made the whole world a gulag. It would not be an exaggeration to say that Soviet, quote, anti-Trotskyism, end quote, at the beginning of the 1990s was a complex product of the Stalin era. Against that background, the few objective essays on Trotsky that appeared were marked by extreme caution and reticence. One can say that in the West, too, Trotsky had not been entirely fortunate. In the works written by Trotskyists, Trotsky's personality was, as a rule, detached from its historical content, while in academic researches, Trotsky's views were presented as though identical with present-day Trotskyism. Yet Trotsky expresses most completely, perhaps, the contradictoriness of the October phenomenon. A couple of footnotes here. It appears that the best of them are the 3 volumes by Isaac Deutscher, The Prophet Armed, 1954, The Prophet Unarmed, 1959, The Prophet Outcast, 1963, and the recent book by Pierre Brouet, Trotsky. This is the case, and footnote. Footnote. This is the case in particular of one of the recent monographs, Peter Beilhartz's Trotsky, Trotskyism, and the Transition to Socialism. I would say that that's a false representation of that book, that Peter Beilhartz collapses Trotsky into Trotskyism. I would say the second half of the book, which deals with Mandel, Deutscher, and James and Dunayevskaya, the inclusion of James and Dunayevskaya kind of shows the diversity of post-Trotsky Trotskyism, even though obviously you'd have to say post-Trotskyist when referring to James and Dunayevskaya. Where am I? End footnote. Trotsky is more than a natural product of the revolution. Trotsky was, in a way, a typical representative of that special marginal milieu known as Russia's radical intelligentsia, quote, outside the order of estates, end quote, which by the beginning of the 20th century included not only persons with the psychology of, quote, penitent noblemen, end quote, but also elements of bourgeois origin. Footnote. Trotsky has left an extremely acute description of this phenomenon. See his article concerning the intelligentsia, which was published in Partisan Review in fall 1968. End footnote. Trotsky severed early on his links with his own family. Trotsky was a, quote, marginal personality, end quote, who in the specifically ethno-psychological sense, a scion of the Jewish community. Trotsky openly despised this community for its small-town limitedness and petty bourgeois way of life. In this respect, he resembled Karl Marx. The Russian intelligentsia strove to create for itself, on the basis of the most radical doctrines it could borrow, a special subculture of its own, a sort of antidote to what Peter Kropotkin called, quote, a whole world of habits, customs, ways of thinking, and moral cowardice, end quote. In principle, given the conditions of an evolutionary development of society, this process might have culminated in the establishment of the complex of ideas typical of a law-governed society. But the intelligentsia milieu found itself in a socially stressed situation which was made worse, as V.I. Vernadsky noted, by its isolation from the directly productive forces of the country. I'm not sure if this is who is being referred to, but I'm going to list them anyway. Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky lived from 1863 to 1945 and was a Russian, Ukrainian, and Soviet mineralogist and geochemist who is considered one of the founders of geochemistry, biogeochemistry, and radiogeology. Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky was one of the founders and the first presidents of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, now National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Vladimir Vernadsky is most noted for his 1926 book, The Biosphere, in which he inadvertently worked to popularize Edward Seuss's 1875 term biosphere by hypothesizing that life is the geological force that shapes the Earth. In 1943, Vernadsky was awarded the Stalin Prize. Vernadsky's portrait is depicted on the Ukrainian 1,000 hryvnia banknote. Back to the text. Hence the intelligentsia's peculiar emotional state as observed by Maxim Gorky, which led to, quote, the preaching of social fanaticism, end quote, and, quote, an extreme instability of democratic sentiments, end quote. Against this background, Trotsky could be called a case of, quote, marginality squared, end quote. Trotsky sometimes openly despised the mass of the intelligentsia for its extreme ambivalence, quoting N.K. Mikhailovsky's idea that the Russian intelligent was, quote, split in two, and, quote, humanism in thought, idleness in action, end quote. Social contempt, of course, gives force only to all-embracing negativism and not to the creation of positive doctrines. The usual means whereby a revolutionary thinker is preserved from a destructive dose of skepticism is a primordial Protestant religious sense of purpose. Soviet philosophers have recently distinguished this in the early Marx and Engels. It was no accident that in Russia so many revolutionaries came from priestly families. When they, quote, repented, end quote, they usually returned to religion and of devout nationalism. Trotsky's position was more difficult, and it cannot be accidental that in 1938, in Trotsky's article, Their Morals and Ours, Trotsky spoke of himself as one, quote, who does not care to return to Moses, Christ, or Muhammad, end quote. In principle, a, quote, marginal personality, end quote, is in every epoch destined for a tragic fate, as we see with Byron's Cain, William Faulkner's Joe Christmas, or Ivan Karamazov. I don't know these references, so I'm going to look them up. If there's something quick and easy to read, I'm going to read them. Cain is a dramatic work by Lord Byron, published in 1821. In Cain, Byron dramatizes the story of Cain and Abel from Cain's point of view. Cain is an example of the literary genre known as closet drama. The play commences with Cain refusing to participate in his family's prayer of thanksgiving to God. Cain tells his father he has nothing to thank God for because he is fated to die. As Cain explains in an early soliloquy, Cain regards his mortality as an unjust punishment for Adam and Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden, an event detailed in the book of Genesis. Cain's anxiety over his morality is heightened by the fact that Cain does not know what death is. At one point in Act 1, Cain recalls keeping watch at night for the arrival of death, which he imagines to be an anthropomorphic entity. The character who supplies Cain with knowledge of death is Lucifer. In Act 2, Lucifer leads Cain on a voyage to the, quote, abyss of space, and shows him a catastrophic vision of the Earth's natural history, complete with spirits of extinct life forms like the mammoth. Cain returns to Earth in Act 3, depressed by this vision of universal death. At the climax of the play, Cain murders Abel. The play concludes with Cain's banishment. And who's the next one? William Faulkner's Joe Christmas. Apparently, Joe Christmas is a character in William Faulkner's Late in August. Joe Christmas also stands out as one of the novel's most enigmatic characters. An angry man, Joe Christmas is a shadow figure who walks the fringes, treading neither lightly nor comfortably in both the black and white worlds. When Joe first appears, he provokes a healthy amount of curiosity on the part of the mill workers, accompanied by contempt for his smug aloofness and other disarming qualities. Although Faulkner provides many details of Joe Christmas's life and character over the course of his tale, Joe Christmas still remains a distant, inscrutable figure, closed and elusive. At the mill he is a cipher, a blank slate onto which other projects their own biased and subjective notions of who they think the mysterious man truly is. Many believe that he hails from an unknown foreign country. Several loose correlations connect Joe Christmas's life to that of Jesus. The two figures share the same initials. Joe was left on the orphanage steps on Christmas. Joe is in his early 30s when he is killed in the standoff in Hightower's kitchen. But these suggestions of similarity are loose and gestural, following Faulkner to complicate and darken the moral nature of his protagonist. Faulkner's characterization of Joe Christmas challenges and ultimately subverts any Christ-like comparisons. Any attempt to see Joe Christmas as a martyr is complicated by his life of violence and his general contempt for humanity. Joe Christmas emerges as a classically flawed and conflicted modern anti-hero. A brooding loner, Joe Christmas is a man without an identity. Unaware of his birth name, much less his racial heritage, Joe Christmas wanders in a futile search for a place where he can belong. Whereas Jesus' life inspired emulation and praise, Joe Christmas generates little sympathy from those around him. The grim conditions that surrounded his upbringings do little to explain or dismiss his compulsive need to inflict harm on others, and, in two cases, to go so far as to take a life. Christmas's attempt to reclaim and establish his identity in the world is marred by a disdain for the very people who could possibly provide him with the comfort he seeks. So that's from SparkNotes about Joe Christmas from William Faulkner's Light in August. And then Ivan Karamazov. Sorry, I'm trying to find. Yeah, sorry, I can't. All right. So here's the Wikipedia entry for Ivan Karamazov. Ivan Fedorovich, sometimes referred to as Vanya, is the 24-year-old middle son and the first from Fyodor Pavlovich's second marriage. Ivan Karamazov is reserved and aloof, but also intellectually brilliant. Ivan Karamazov's dictum, quote, "If there is no God, everything is lawful," end quote, is a recurring motif in the novel. At first, Ivan seems not to have much time for his brother Alyosha, but later their bond and mutual affection deepens. Ivan finds his father repulsive and also has a strong antipathy towards Dmitri. Fyodor Pavlovich tells Alyosha that he fears Ivan more than he fears Dmitri. Ivan falls in love with Katerina Ivanovna, but their intimacy develops in the shadow of her prior connection to Dmitri, and her ambivalence is a source of torment to him. Some of the most acclaimed passages of the brothers Karamazov involve Ivan, including the chapters Rebellion and the chapter The Grand Inquisitor from Book 5, and the three conversations with Smerdyakov, and the subsequent chapter Ivan's Nightmare of the Devil in Book 11. Book 5, entitled Pro and Contra, is primarily about, quote, the inner debate taking place in Ivan between his recognition of the moral sublimity of the Christian ideal and his outrage against a universe of pain and suffering. That's according to Frank, who's that? Joseph Frank. Ivan's rejection of God is posited in terms of the Christian value of compassion, the value that Dostoevsky himself, through the character of Prince Mishkin in The Idiot, called, quote, the chief and perhaps the only law of all human existence, end quote. Thus, Ivan's rejection of God is justified by the very principle at the heart of Christianity. For Ivan, the absurdity of all human history is proven by the senselessness of the suffering of children. If reason or rationality is the measure, God's world cannot be accepted. All the examples Ivan gives of horrors perpetrated against children were taken by Dostoevsky from actual newspaper accounts and historical sources. Okay, so back to the text. For the time being, the Russian revolutionary intelligenti were saved by faith. Trotsky, like the Raznochintsy of the 1860s to 1890s, believed in the people. Subsequently, Trotsky had occasion more than once to change his social orientation. According to Wikipedia, Raznochintsy was an official category introduced in the Digest of Laws of the Russian Empire in the 17th century for a socialist state that included the lower court and governmental ranks, children of personal dvorians, and discharged military. The category of Raznochintsy grew significantly during the massive trimming down of the category of service class people in the second half of the 17th century. Raznochintsy were of taxable estate, meaning those who had to pay poll tax. In the mid-18th century, the category was abolished and a significant part of Raznochintsy were transferred into peasantry, but many became merchants in various urban categories. As a result, Raznochintsy of the 17th and 18th centuries significantly contributed to the urban growth in Siberia. Later in the common speech, the term Raznochintsy acquired a somewhat opposite meaning. Raznochintsy became to denote persons of non-noble origin who, due to their education, were excluded from the taxable status and can apply for the status of personal distinguished citizenship. A significant number of Russian intelligentsia of the 19th century were Raznochintsy. Back to the text. Trotsky, like the Raznochintsy of the 1860s to 1890s, believed in the people. Subsequently, Trotsky had occasion more than once to change his social orientation. Trotsky's first change of views was connected with his turn from the Narodniks to the Marxists. From the late 1890s in Russia, this was altogether a very significant move, and Trotsky made it with particular passion. Trotsky's bitter attacks on the apostate P.B. Struve are well known. It seems that his conversion to Marxism did not rid Trotsky of his populistic ways. Wikipedia says Peter Struve, or P.B. Struve, lived from 1870 to 1944 as a Russian political economist, philosopher, historian, and editor. P.B. Struve started his career as a Marxist, later became a liberal, and after the Bolshevik Revolution joined the White Movement. From 1920, Struve lived in exile in Paris, where he was a prominent critic of Russian communism. Back to the text. Trotsky's bitter attacks on, quote, apostate P.B. Struve are well known. It seems that Trotsky's conversion to Marxism did not rid Trotsky of his populistic ways, which marked him off from many spineless intelligenti, and these came to be combined with faith in the immutability of the laws of history. Hence Trotsky's sense that he personally was at the cutting edge of social progress. Hence, too, Trotsky's special fervor as a neophyte calling to the, quote, uninitiated. But then, this is rather typical. There is an opinion that all revolutionary leaders have combined, quote, radical voluntarism and anthropological pessimism, end quote. They strive to do a favor by force to the, quote, undeveloped, end quote, mass of the people. Footnote, see Feher, The Dictatorship Over Needs in Telos, Spring 1978. I'm going to see if I can get the abstract for this piece. I'm going to wait to see if perhaps the internet will work sometime this century, but, we all can't be so lucky. Anyway, end footnote. I'll read the description of that book later if the internet decides to work. Russian history shows more than enough examples of that. Trotsky felt himself to be a, quote, citizen of the world, end quote, who was training, quote, provincials, end quote, to follow the road to universal progress. Reference is made rather often to a mechanistic quality in Trotsky's thinking, but that is hardly correct. One has to remember that this was a characteristic of every determinist mentality in that period. And in the intelligentsia milieu, any nuances of personal opinion were considered an impermissible luxury. Trotsky, of course, took that into account. Unquestionably, Trotsky remained within the framework of the political culture of the Second International, but that was true until October of the overwhelming majority of Bolsheviks as well. Trotsky, however, was distinguished by a special sort of leftism. This is usually associated with the theory of, quote, permanent revolution, the source of which was belief that in the 20th century a bourgeois revolution had become impossible, because the, quote, internationalization, end quote, of capital endowed every revolutionary explosion with an international proletarian character. There is, though, another point of view, namely that what was distinctive of Trotsky was a Jacobin dichotomism in his thought, a conception of social consciousness as bipolar, counterpoising the proletariat to all the other classes. Trotsky really did surrender himself to belief in the, quote, saving mission, end quote, of the international proletariat. Can we make out, in this connection, a basic world outlook to which Trotsky's thinking always returned after recurrent confusions? It would appear that we can, if we define his attitude to the ideas of freedom and culture, taking into account the fact that the erosion of these principles is fraught with danger for the revolutionary and for the revolution as a whole. Characteristic of Russian social thought, beginning in the 19th century, was a certain interpretation of the idea of the unity of all mankind. In Trotsky's opinion, this tendency served no practical purpose. Following Chaadev maybe, Daev, Trotsky considered Russian society did not produce ideas itself, but merely borrowed them. Wikipedia says, Pyotr Chaadev lived from 1794 to 1856 and was a Russian philosopher. Chaadev was one of the Russian Schelengians. Chaadev wrote 8, quote, philosophical letters about Russia in French between 1826 and 1831, which circulated among intellectuals in Russia in manuscript form for many years. They comprise an indictment of Russian culture, for Russian culture's laggard role far behind the leaders of Western civilization. Chaadev cast doubt on the greatness of the Russian past and ridiculed orthodoxy for failing to provide a sound spiritual basis for the Russian mind. He extolled the achievements of Europe, especially in rational and logical thought, Europe's progressive spirit, Europe's leadership in science, and indeed Europe's leadership on the path to freedom. The Russian government saw Pyotr Chaadev's ideas as dangerous and unsound. After some were published, they were all banned by the censorship press. Because there was nothing to charge him with, Chaadev was declared legally insane and put under constant medical supervision, though this was a formality rather than a real administrative abuse. Back to the text. The abstract for The Dictatorship Over Needs by Ferenc Feher says, To understand the structure of East European societies as systems of dictatorships over needs, it's important to see them as anti-capitalist formations. They are the result of anti-capitalist revolutions or of the military political expansion of once victorious revolutions, and they represent a response and challenge to capitalism. Thus, they cannot be described in terms of present capitalist societies, and as such, they can be regarded as socialist experiments. Analyses such as the Trotskyist mythology of a quote thermidor concerning the advent of a new bourgeoisie would only confuse the issues and prevent an understanding of the new type of alienation these societies have generated. It's a pretty gross misunderstanding of Trotsky's and Orthodox Trotskyism's conception of the Soviet Union. But anyway, that's the description of the essay, at least. So, back to the text. Following Chadaev, Trotsky considered that Russian society did not produce ideas itself, but merely borrowed them, as he saw it when even V. Solovev was for this reason unable to create a school of his own in Russia. It says Vladimir Solovyov. Vladimir Solovyov lived from 1853 to 1900. Vladimir Solovyov was a Russian philosopher, theologian, poet, pamphleteer, and literary critic. Vladimir Solovyov played a significant role in the development of Russian philosophy and poetry at the end of the 19th century and in the spiritual renaissance of the early 20th century. Back to the text. The achievements of Russian social thought might be admired, but it was impossible to be guided by them. Hence the revolutionary, quote, globalism, which Trotsky deliberately, and probably not without inner resistance, counterpoised to socio-cultural tradition. At the same time, Trotsky was not at all a nihilist of the Bazarov type, a phenomenon he liked to recall. I'm not sure who this Bazarov is referring to, so I'm just going to move on. Trotsky's intense attention to the culture of the past was due to a clear awareness that if the revolution was not made fast by a new socio-cultural stereotype, it would be doomed to moral degeneration. Lenin solved this question simply. Lenin divided the cultural heritage into, quote, democratic and, quote, reactionary elements, and regarded it as necessary to take possession of the democratic elements alone. Bukharin showed himself to be a light-minded prolet cultist. Trotsky was a different case. The problem of world revolution was for Trotsky a question of the globalizing of culture. Okay, so I think I actually know what Bazarov is being referred to now. Vladimir Bazarov lived from 1874 to 1939. And Vladimir Bazarov was a Russian Marxist revolutionary, journalist, philosopher, and economist. Born as Vladimir Alexandrovich Rudnev, Bazarov is best remembered as a pioneer in the development of economic planning in the Soviet Union. Vladimir Bazarov was one of the Russian Machists, as Lenin dubbed the term, and was a close friend of Alexander Bogdanov. Back to the text. Trotsky was, of course, against total destruction of the, quote, of the old, quote, bourgeois, unquote, culture, despite the fact that its, quote, maddened power, end quote, bore the guilt of unleashing the world war. Trotsky, Literature and Revolution. See Trotsky, Literature and Revolution. Quote, I don't believe that the whole of European culture is doomed to perdition, That capital will destroy it with impunity, end quote, Trotsky said, even after October. Trotsky. It was from this standpoint that Trotsky also sought to evaluate literary life in Russia after the Civil War. The outcome was original. It turned out that, while the revolution had overthrown the bourgeoisie, it definitely had not ousted that class from the cultural sphere. In the creative writing of his time, Trotsky distinguished an old, quote, non-October literature, end quote, as a Soviet, quote, peasant singing, end quote, literature, and also, quote, bohemian revolutionary, end quote, futurism, which was a peculiar offshoot of the previous artistic heritage. Quote, proletarian art, end quote, was going through a period of apprenticeship. It is likely that Trotsky made this evaluation according to the, quote, class, end quote, principle, not without inner resistance. Trotsky undertook no apologia for, quote, proletarian art, and, quote, it is fundamentally incorrect to contrast bourgeois culture and bourgeois art with proletarian culture and proletarian art, end quote. Trotsky declared firmly, quote, the latter will never exist. Proletarian art and proletarian culture will never exist because the proletarian regime is temporary and transient. The historic significance and the moral grandeur of the proletarian revolution consists in the fact that the proletarian revolution is laying the foundation of a culture which is above classes and which will be the first culture that is truly human, end quote. Trotsky. Literature and Revolution. At the same time, Trotsky resolutely refused to put the sign of equality between the, quote, class content of literature and literature's aesthetic value. Trotsky considered that, where culture was concerned, the proletariat has to stand on the shoulders of the proletariat's predecessors. Consequently, Trotsky called on the proletariat to show tolerance to its many, quote, fellow travelers. Thus, with all his revolutionary impatience, Trotsky's desire to urge progress forward, Trotsky recognized that the revolution was conceivable only as a protracted socio-cultural process of transformation. To what extent could the proletarian state intervene in this process? Quote, we must, take possession politically of the most important elements of the old culture, to such an extent, at least, as to be able to pave the way for a new culture, end quote. But this must be done with the greatest caution. The task to be given priority was that of raising the people's cultural level. Hence Trotsky's appeal to the youth and his hopes for, quote, mass culture, end quote. There's a view that post-October writing about the revolution was wholly permeated with the theme of, quote, death birth, consonant with Christian eschatology. For instance, see R. Freeborn's The Russian Revolutionary Novel, published in 1982. Damn it. Let's look this book up. Oh man, I could see it being in the dustbin and not have a description readily available. It looks like there is a description on Google Books, so let's read it. This was published with Cambridge Press in 1982. Professor Freeborn's book is an attempt to identify and define the evolution of a particular kind of novel in Russian and Soviet literature, the revolutionary novel. This genre is a uniquely Russian phenomenon and one that is of central importance in the Russian literature. The study begins with a consideration of Turgenev's masterpiece, Fathers and Children, and traces the evolution of the revolutionary novel through to its most important development a century later in Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago and the emergence of a dissident literature in the Soviet Union. Professor Freeborn examines the particular phases of the genre's development, and in particular the development after 1917, the early fiction which explored the relationship between revolution and instinct, such as Pilniak's The Naked Year, the first attempts at myth-making in Leonov's The Badgers, and Furmanov's Chapayev. The next phase, in which novelists turn to the investigation of ideas, exemplified most notably in Zamyatin's We, the resumption of the classical approaches in such works as Olesha's Envy, which explores the interaction between the individual and society, and finally the appearance of the revolutionary epic in Maxim Gorky's The Life of Klim Samgin, Sholokov's Quiet Flows the Dawn, and Alexei Tolstoy's The Road to Calvary. Professor Robert Freeborn, so it says Richard Freeborn also examines the way this kind of novel has undergone change in response to revolutionary change, and Freeborn shows how an important feature of this process has been the implicit assumption that the revolutionary novel is distinguished by its right to pass an objective, independent judgment on revolution and the revolutionary image of man. This is a comprehensive and challenging study of a uniquely Russian tradition of writing, which draws in a great range of novels, many of them little known in the West. As with other titles in this series, all quotations have been translated. Back to the text and footnote. There is a view that post-October writing about the revolution was wholly permeated with the theme of, quote, death birth, consonant with Christian eschatology. Trotsky realized this, quote, in spite of occasional cruelty and the sanguinary relentlessness of its methods, the revolution is, before and above all, the awakening of humanity's onward work, and is marked with a growing respect for the personal dignity of every individual, with an ever-increasing concern for those who are weak, end quote. Trotsky wrote in Pravda, 15th of May, 1923. Thus Trotsky's worldview, despite Trotsky's ostentatious apologia for revolutionary coercion, was determined nevertheless by a general humanist constant. Trotsky's attitude to democracy confirms this. In principle, Trotsky unquestionably gave preference to civil society over dictatorship. Trotsky thought highly of the, quote, innovatory experiments, end quote, made by those emigrants from Europe who were the first in the world to proclaim, on the soil of America, the inalienability of the rights of man and the citizen. The revolutionary epoch itself made Trotsky a convinced anti-parliamentarian. As he saw it, representative democracy had become the principal brake on progress. Quote, the most dangerous of the aberrations of the revolution arises when the mechanical accountant of democracy balances in one column yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and thereby impels the formal Democrats to look for the head of the revolution, where in reality is to be found in its very heavy tail, end quote. Tail. Trotsky later wrote. In History of the Russian Revolution, Volume 1. In 1917, not accidentally, Trotsky changed from being the would-be writer of social democracy into a thunderer against social democratic conciliation with the bourgeoisie. It would have been hard to give a greater shock to the Democrats of that time than the one Trotsky gave them. For example, in analyzing his speech at the Democratic Conference, the right-wing socialist Kievskaya Misl, the very paper in which Trotsky had regularly published his articles on literature and art for several years before the war, commented, quote, Trotsky is not merely a talented orator. Trotsky is a great politician, not a dilettante and not a politician by trade, but a politician from passion. Trotsky has a great deal of intelligence and of knowledge. Trotsky has traveled all over the world, ... Trotsky understands everything but does not love much. To the people of today, with their dark, gloomy souls and real blood, Trotsky is profoundly indifferent. The world, with all its horrors and great tragedies, appears in his imagination as a striking spectacle composed of absolutely antagonistic forces, in which he, Citizen Trotsky, has been chosen and prepared for the role of LaSalle. Trotsky has a cold intellect and a still colder heart, but Trotsky is endowed with iron pertinacity. All Trotsky's thoughts and all his works are steeped in that pertinacity. It gives his thrust enormous striking force, end quote. Kievskaya Misil, 27th of September, 1917. This description does not lack shrewdness. At the same time, it shows how furious, quote, class, end quote, passion antagonized the Democrats. Capital D Democrats. It is appropriate to point out that the elemental force of revolution itself tended to oppose parliamentarism. This was Trotsky's real source of inspiration. Footnote: when analyzing revolutions, one must never underestimate the influence exercised on the leaders by the masses. Antonio Gramsci noted that, quote, the gigantic strength of the masses, exerts an almost unbearable pressure on the isolated individual, demanding from him the greatest possible output of volitional energy, end quote. Gramsci. End footnote. To a considerable extent, it was what caused Trotsky to take up his, quote, special position, end quote, at the time of Brest-Litovsk. It impelled Trotsky afterwards to talk like a Narodnik. Quote, we shall create one brotherly state on the land which nature gave us. This land we shall plow and cultivate on associative principles, turn into one blossoming garden, where our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren will live as in a paradise, end quote. He said in April 1918. One may suppose that this was not just a revolutionary prophecy intended to correspond with the chiliastic hopes of the masses, but Trotsky's own conception at that time of what was to be Russia's future. Trotsky was in those days manifestly against statism. A revolutionary upsurge grips its leaders, but also engenders the illusion that they are omnipotent. Time went by, and People's Commissar for Military Affairs Trotsky, who had formerly been a very civilian sort of person, began to assert that the militarization of social life provided the best road for educating the man of the, quote, new culture, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote: the actual expression does not appear at the reference given. What Trotsky says is, quote, what does militarizing mean? Militarizing means inculcating the sense of responsibility and therefore forming the best type of cultured person, end quote. That quote is taken from How the Revolution Armed, Volume 2, 1979. Apparently this book documents is a collection of documents. Is a collection of documents that discusses the formation and history of the Red Army, 1918 to 1923. End footnote. This idea corresponded to the whole psycho-mentality of war communism. However, Trotsky himself became drawn into the process which eventually established the, quote, command and, quote, style in the economy. On the 11th of February 1920, Trotsky telegraphed from Samara to Lenin and Rykov, quote, the Economic Council, Sovnarkov, must be given, as a special task, the duty to increase at any cost the production of paper. In the absence of a gigantic expansion in agitational work, we cannot talk seriously about labor armies and labor service. The reduction in the amount of agitational literature which has taken place, the closing down of local newspapers and so on, are radically subverting the work of economic recovery. I propose that a meeting be held to draft emergency measures for dealing with this problem, end quote. Trotsky. Such a statement, analyzed in the context of, quote, war communism, is quite understandable, but it shows how the, quote, war communist, end quote, mentality departed from, quote, normal common sense and strengthened the tendency towards partocracy, quote, partocracy at the expense of purely intellectual considerations. To Trotsky's credit, it must be said that Trotsky realized the need to return to common sense. Evidence of this is given by Trotsky's famous letter of February 1920 to the Central Committee about replacing the requisitioning of grain by a tax in kind. This was not yet, of course, the new economic policy, but Trotsky was more prepared for its introduction than were other Bolshevik leaders. In analyzing the movement of Trotsky's doctrinal aims, we have to note that during the Civil War years, Trotsky made a final break with the usual linear conception of the development of the revolutionary process. The idea of permanent revolution was transformed into Trotsky's revolutionary geopolitical vision of the contemporary world. As early as the 1st of May 1919, Trotsky wrote in Pravda about a possible transfer of the center of the Third International to Berlin, Paris, or London. In August 1919, there followed a fresh proposal, Trotsky's famous note about a plan to strike at world imperialism through the East. This is sometimes seen as part of the utopian notion of world revolution. If, however, we consider that during the Civil War, Great Britain was, above all, worried about retaining its colonial rule over India, and that technically it was quite realistic to organize a cavalry breakthrough into India, Trotsky's proposal appeared reasonable enough. In this connection, it should be mentioned that in 1923, the outstanding Tatar revolutionary M. Sultan Galiev proposed, in the event of a weakening of the European impulse of the world revolution, the adoption of a multiform plan for activating the revolutionary process in the East. Wikipedia says Mircea Sultan Galiev lived from 1892 to 1940, also known as Mirza Sultan Galiev, was a Tatar Bolshevik revolutionary who rose to prominence in the Russian Communist Party in the early 1920s. Mircea Sultan Galiev was the architect of Muslim, quote, national communism. His views were seen as a direct threat to the policies of the Comintern. He was imprisoned briefly in 1923 and expelled from the Communist Party. He was rearrested in 1928 and imprisoned for 6 years. Mircea Sultan Galiev was then arrested again in 1937 and executed in 1940 during the Stalin period. Back to the text. In this connection, it should be mentioned that in 1923, the outstanding Tatar revolutionary M. Sultan Galiev proposed, in the event of a weakening of the European impulse of the world revolution, the adoption of a multiform plan for activating the revolutionary process in the East. The idea of revolutionary geopolitics, active utilization of the Chinese and Indian factors as Soviet Russia found itself isolated, was put forward by Lenin too towards the end of his life. Trotsky's ideas thus amounted to what can be called a systematic analysis of the revolutionary developments on the world scale. This was what, to a considerable degree, defined the distinctiveness of Trotsky's position in the 1920s. With historical hindsight, it is clear that the introduction of the new economic policy had to be accompanied by the creation of a two-block system of representation. Once the market mechanism of economic collaboration had been stabilized, the workers and peasants might be able to come to an agreement between them. What actually happened was the opposite. The Bolshevik Party consolidated itself after staging a trial of its most dangerous opponents, the socialist revolutionaries, banishing unwelcome representatives of Russia's, quote, bourgeois science and culture, and waging a campaign without precedent against the Orthodox clergy. A great variety of factors brought about this turn into a dead end. The extreme situation caused by the famine of 1921, the psychological inability of the victors to surrender even part of their power, and their desperate hopes for world revolution, which grew especially strong in 1923. The new economic policy was doomed, for it proceeded under the sign of the strengthening party bureaucracy. Trotsky found himself placed in a rather difficult position. By a cruel irony of fate, Trotsky had, on the one hand, to restrain those very war communist moods which had developed, not without help from Trotsky, and, on the other, to keep to the generally accepted rhetoric, as this was now a ritual element in the functioning of partocratic rule. In these circumstances, any revolutionary leader would have suffered a feeling of disorientation, and, undoubtedly, Trotsky did not escape such a crisis. What determined the development of Trotsky's thinking during the transition to the new economic policy? What doctrinal imperative predominated with Trotsky? There is a view that Trotsky, having mastered well the lessons of the Great French Revolution, directed Trotsky's efforts mainly to preventing a, quote, thermidor. Footnote. See Isaac Deutscher, Marxism, Wars, and Revolution, Essays from 4 Decades, published in 1984. That would have been published after Deutscher's death. And this book has a preface by Perry Anderson and is edited by Tamara Deutscher. And the description from Verso book says, a lasting collection of some of Deutscher's most powerful texts. Isaac Deutscher is widely recognized as one of the foremost political biographers of the 20th century, and his full-scale studies of Trotsky and Stalin, translated into many world languages, have played a major role in elucidating the character and fate of the Russian Revolution. This collection of essays, hitherto unpublished or out of print, provides a clear idea of the range and force of Deutscher's literary activity over a period of more than 30 years. It also demonstrates Deutscher's essential consistency of purpose, from his sharp denunciation of the First Moscow trial in 1936, through his resistance to the Cold War tides of the 50s, to his sober analysis of the Chinese Cultural Revolution in 1966. Deutscher's fidelity to the Marxist method and firm grasp of socialist history allowed Deutscher to penetrate to the core of events without ever falling into the blind apologetics or feverish disavows that blighted so many left-wing intellectuals of his generation. Deutscher's own origins in the Polish communist movement are here reflected in Deutscher's famous interview on the tragedy of the Polish Communist Party, while his major essay on bureaucracy is one of the first sustained attempts to grapple with this key theoretical and practical problem for the socialist movement. This volume is designed both as a lasting collection of some of Deutscher's best-known and most powerful texts, and as an introduction for readers approaching his work for the first time. A specially written preface by Perry Anderson assesses this selection in relation to Deutscher's overall achievement. And Tamara Deutscher's introduction passes on to the reader the often fascinating personal background to certain of the essays. Back to the text. End footnote. Trotsky himself mentioned that before the introduction of the new economic policy, and in its first phase, Trotsky had conversations about this subject with Lenin. Footnote, see the article Thermidor in The Challenge of the Left Opposition, 1926 to 1927. End footnote. But at that time, the danger of a thermidor was traditionally linked with the numerical preponderance of the peasantry. More sustainable appears the view that Trotsky concerned himself seriously with the problem of thermidor only after 1926, in connection with the struggle against Stalin and Stalin's circle. Footnote, see Baraknai Paz, page 394. End footnote. It was no accident that Trotsky distinguished between the, quote, Kronstadt Thermidor and the, quote, Stalinist Thermidor, even while indicating that there was a certain continuity between them. Footnote, see Reply to Maniewski and Kronstadt, both dated the 3rd of August 1927. Neither of these is in the Challenge of the Left Opposition book. End footnote. It would appear that the fight against bureaucratism was of secondary importance for Trotsky during the initial phase of the new economic policy. Trotsky treated economic questions as the matter of first importance at this time. Trotsky continued, of course, to see himself principally as the theoretician of world revolution, but here he lagged behind the real process of history. After the First World War, with the establishment of universal suffrage in the European countries, the introduction of the 8-hour day, and a series of social programs, evolutionary tendencies necessarily prevailed. Trotsky clearly underestimated this factor, being influenced, apparently, by his memories of the failure of the reforming efforts of Russia's provisional government. Footnote, he made a typical statement to this effect in 1922. End footnote. But now the integrity of Trotsky's outlook, so necessary for overcoming psychological crisis, was determined by something different, by statism and technocratism. Documents recently published enable us to conclude that Trotsky was at variance in principle with Stalin and his circle of apparatus men. In particular, Trotsky's letter of the 23rd of October 1923 to the Central Committee and the Central Control Commission of the party, and his polemic with Stalin at the joint plenum of these bodies on the 26th of October, leave no doubt that Trotsky, in promoting his idea of transferring the center of gravity of state activity to the Supreme Economic Council and Gosplan, was essentially proposing to, quote, depoliticize, end quote, the work of administration. Stalin saw in this a threat to domination by the party apparatus and defended its existence in doctrinal demagogy. Trotsky unquestionably tried, from the very beginning of the new economic policy, to construct an optimal model for the administration of the economy, which took account of Russia's place in the world economy. Trotsky's starting point was the idea of retaining the state sector of the economy, identified as the basic element of socialism. It might seem that this fully conformed to the general party conceptions of that time. But Trotsky's approach to economic questions was much broader. At the basis of Trotsky's views lay the idea of the international division of labor, which was something new against the background of war communist autarky. Trotsky demanded, in this regard, that, quote, the flower of the young generation, end quote, be given the task of undertaking, quote, independent theoretical work on questions of the revolution in close connection with all our internal and international activity, end quote. Trotsky. Did this mean that Trotsky had been transformed from the ideologist of world revolution into a Russian economic theorist? Richard B. Day, who on the whole supports this view, at the same time directs attention to the point that in 1924-26, Trotsky, unlike Zinoviev and Kamenev, did not object to Stalin's idea of building socialism, quote, in one country taken separately, end quote. And only later worked out his own original view of socialism in one country, which would not be isolated from the world economy, a notion which lay midway between the lines of Bukharin and Stalin. Footnote, see Day's Leon Trotsky and the Politics of Economic Isolation, pages 36 and 150. Day overestimates, of course, Stalin's capacity for independent thinking in general, and fails to allow for the imminent instability and scholasticism of Bukharin, but at the same time, Day evaluates correctly the well-thought-out and original views of Trotsky on economic questions. It is necessary, though, to take more fully into account the factor of ideological reflection to which he was undoubtedly susceptible in 1924 to 26. Also, being willy-nilly a, quote, oppositionist, Trotsky was placed in a false position. Trotsky had, in any case, to act within the framework of the established mentality, to uphold the unity of the party's leadership, while knowing that it had fallen into flagrantly unworthy hands, to reject the accusation of faction forming, while knowing that, in fact, Trotsky's views were incompatible with the attitudes prevailing in the party, and to insist on command methods of administration in both inner political life and in the common term, while knowing that these ought to be not perfected, but restricted. Contrary to the habit of a revolutionary tribune, Trotsky was obliged to put forward his views with extreme caution, appearing as merely a, quote, interpreter of the heritage of Lenin. In short, Trotsky expressed his views in the 1920s in consciously inadequate form. In analyzing the nature of, quote, Trotskyism, it is appropriate to begin with Marx himself. From the outset, Marxism was not free from ambivalence. As a politician, Marx stressed the class dividedness of social being under capitalism. As a theoretician, Marx certainly appreciated the interconnectedness of the socioeconomic organism created by the bourgeoisie. During most of his life, Lenin treated as absolute the first mentioned factor, the class dividedness of social being under capitalism, in Marx's teaching, rather than the other, the interconnectedness of the socioeconomic organism created by the bourgeoisie. And when Lenin came to power, he did not succeed fully in looking in a new way at the working of the economic mechanism. Trotsky, unlike Lenin, adopted from the outset Lassalle's conception of the organic connection between all economic phenomena. Trotsky's hatred for whatever was, quote, bourgeois had more of an emotional basis. When abroad, Trotsky revealed the essence of his conception of Marxism. Quote, Marxism takes its point of departure from world economy, not as a sum of national parts, end quote, Trotsky wrote. Quote, but as a mighty and independent reality which had been created by the international division of labor and the world market, and which in our epoch imperiously dominates the national markets, end quote. Trotsky. See Introduction to the German edition of The Permanent Revolution. End footnote. Beyond question, such an approach differs markedly from Lenin's views regarding the, quote, insolubility, end quote, of the contradictions of imperialism. The foundation of Trotsky's view was his conviction that the, quote, USSR's economy can develop only as a part of world economy, end quote, which presupposes strengthening its links with the world market and its dependence thereon. Trotsky considered that to take account of this objective factor could be useful in the interest both of economic rebirth and of building socialism. Let us recall that at this time Stalin was publicly declaring that dependence made the country, quote, more vulnerable to the blows of our enemies, end quote. Stalin. Nowadays, Trotsky's proposition seems an elementary truth for the practitioners of, quote, catching up with, end quote, and, quote, surpassing development. In the 1920s, however, quite different attitudes prevailed among the Bolsheviks. Trotsky's proposition could be regarded by them as a case of ideological disarmament in the face of, quote, world imperialism, end quote. And in that connection, it seems almost incredible that Trotsky, whose name was associated with the idea of world revolution propagated by force, nevertheless had the courage to put forward such an idea. The development of the worldwide revolutionary process was now seen by him not only in the context of the collapse of capitalism, but also as a guarantee of peaceful socialist construction in the USSR. Did this signify recognition of the prospects of, quote, peaceful coexistence, end quote? Hardly, but it was a repudiation of revolutionary adventurism. Trotsky's idea, which Trotsky formulated most clearly at the end of 1926, was based on the assumption that there would be temporary periods of stabilization in the world economy. Given that it was difficult to establish the rhythm of a capitalist economy, Trotsky proposed that three possible variants be taken into consideration. Quote, A. A new upsurge of Europe on capitalist foundations. B. Economic decline of Europe. And C. Continuation of the present situation with some vacillations. End quote. Insofar as the new economic policy allowed for a priority growth of agricultural production as compared with industrial, there would, in the first case, be the possibility of increased exports of agricultural product, which would be favorable for economic development generally. But in Trotsky's view, the advantages of such a path would be more than dubious for proletarian power. A quickening of the capitalist elements would inevitably ensue, and that would gradually stifle the state sector of industry. Quote, we should have fallen from our work of socialist construction into a hopeless situation, end quote, Trotsky concluded. This was a completely logical conclusion. If one starts from the identification of socialist development with industrialism, which in those days was regarded as axiomatic. In the event of a downturn in Europe's economic development, Trotsky considered a different situation would arise. Exporting to Europe would become more difficult, and then it would be necessary to reduce imports of equipment. The tempo for building socialism would inevitably slow down. Even if the USSR strengthened its position in Europe, it would find itself in an extremely unfavorable situation in relation to American capitalism. In any case, it would be ridiculous to think of building socialism rapidly in circumstances of a general, quote, decay of the world economy. Trotsky categorically rejected the idea that Russia could obtain temporary advantages by taking a line of indifference to the fate of socialism on the world scale. There remained the variant of, quote, an unstable equilibrium of forces, end quote. Quote, capitalist Europe neither declines nor advances. The proletariat is strong enough to prevent the bourgeoisie from crushing the Soviet Republic, but not strong enough to take power, end quote. This, the actually existing situation, Trotsky considered, was also the most favorable. There was a chance for the USSR to strengthen its position in the economy, and at the same time the European proletariat might become more active. In any case, Trotsky placed his hopes on the revolution, saying that, quote, the capitalist regime has exhausted itself on the world scale because there is no way out of its contradictions, end quote. Trotsky. However, we should note some of the characteristic reservations Trotsky made. Thus, in 1924, Trotsky frankly acknowledged that the Bolsheviks miscalculated the tempo of world revolution. And still earlier in 1922, Trotsky expressed ideas about the left bloc. Footnote. In an article titled On the Paths of the European Revolution, Trotsky says that the Bolsheviks erred in expecting, quote, a rapid and victorious development of the European Revolution, end quote, because they, quote, underestimated the importance of the Revolutionary Party, end quote. End footnote. Later, Trotsky was to show, on this basis, the stupidity of Stalin's attitude to European social democracy as a variety of fascism. We see, then, that fully realistic surmises about the possibility of combining democracy with socialism in Europe occurred to Trotsky quite early, but Trotsky made no attempt at all to develop them with his characteristic vigor. Apparently, it was difficult enough to work out the optimum relation between the introduction of the new economic policy in Russia and support for an independent communist movement throughout the world. However that may be, it is important to try and answer this question. Were Trotsky's views formed into a system of coherent ideas about the new stage in the revolutionary process, or was Trotsky in the main subject to that condition of general ambivalence which was then corroding Bolshevism? On this matter, let us turn our attention to the weakest element in Trotsky's thinking. What seems shakiest are his statements to the effect that the revolution had not succeeded in Western Europe owing to the subjective mistakes and weaknesses of the communist parties. Thus, in 1924, Trotsky said that in Italy in 1919 there had been a, quote, sabotaged revolution, and in Germany in 1923 the communists, quote, had permitted it to slip by, end quote. These views cannot be called innovatory, given that individual Bolsheviks had already recognized that the, quote, commanding, end quote, style of the Comintern leadership had brought about a narrowing of the mass basis of the proletarian movement. It was only in 1926 that Trotsky's position on questions of the international communist movement became sufficiently precise, but this was not a personal contribution on Trotsky's part. At that time, an anti-Stalin bloc was formed, which included some influential Bolsheviks. This opposition declared, as against Stalin's line of building socialism, quote, in one country taken separately, end quote, that, quote, socialism will be victorious in our country in inseparable connection with the revolutions of the European and world proletariat and with the struggle of the East against the imperialist yoke, end quote. Thereafter, Trotsky too was to emphasize this point. Trotsky, however, emphasized mostly that, quote, the principal reason for the survival of the capitalist regime is the incongruity between the objectively revolutionary situation and the insufficient strength of the communist parties. In making such statements, Trotsky was, of course, carrying out the purely tactical task of discrediting the Stalinist leadership. In any case, in September 1926, in his theses for the 14th Conference of the Party, Trotsky ventured to take a very crucial step. Trotsky proposed a change in the tactical line of the international working class movement, which greatly resembled his earlier efforts to unite the forces of the RSDLP. This was, though, no mere reproduction of an old schema. He urged that the entire communist movement be reconstructed, so as to take account of the peculiarities of the movement, in particular countries, and the position of the USSR amid capitalist encirclement. The communist parties of Europe were, in fact, recommended to turn themselves into independent factors in the internal political life of their respective countries. It is important to note that Trotsky proposed to deal with internal economic difficulties in a way that took account of the world conjuncture, understanding that the root of Russia's economic disorders was conditioned by the unbalanced development of the industrial and agricultural sectors of the country's economy. He raised the question of not only restoring the, quote, bond between the proletariat and peasantry, but also achieving a balanced relation between town and country on a market basis, which would allow for price formation in international economic relations. Day considers that he even gave an original description of socialism in terms of international trade. Trotsky's view was that the proletariat's victory on the world scale would have to bring about a rearrangement of the actual foundations of the economy, in accordance with a more productive international division of labor, which would also provide the true basis for socialism. Like Lenin, Trotsky originally hoped that foreigners would take up concessions and grant credits. After the, quote, concessions, end quote, policy had failed, Trotsky laid stress on technological rearmament of the USSR's economy using internal reserves. Trotsky thought that priority should be given to the growth of heavy industry, though Trotsky was certainly not a, quote, super industrializer, end quote, as Stalin and Bukharin later tried to make out. In fact, Trotsky's position was highly flexible. Trotsky proceeded from the notion that, quote, the overall material base of industrialization gave a correct policy and could be considerably increased, but on a given material basis, industrialization should not be pushed ahead with the help of unreal credits, end quote. Trotsky distinguished sharply between growth on the old technical basis, which was fraught with danger of crisis, and a salutary acceleration of the economy on the basis of a renewal of fundamental resources. At the same time, Trotsky appreciated that this approach required rejection of administrative methods and development of producers' democracy, an increase in the productivity of labor, electrification and standardization of production. Trotsky raised the question of the connection between quality and production and the general cultural level and well-being of the working class. Trotsky also advocated the achievement of a balance between wholesale and retail prices for industrial and agricultural products and the development of an infrastructure for the economy. At the time, Trotsky warned against the danger of unleashing market spontaneity and called for a well-thought-out strategy of commercial balance. The declarations of Bukharin and Stalin concerning the, quote, adequacy of the tempo of industrial development met sharp criticism from Trotsky. All Trotsky's proposals and warnings were absolutely reasonable. Some recent research enables one to affirm that on each occasion, Trotsky advocated the most rational decisions. In evaluating Trotsky's views on the organization of the economy, we must mention that they fully conform to the general development of administrative thought in the USSR in the 1920s. We have to remember that despite recognition by leading specialists, especially A. Bogdanov, of the historical limitedness of the authoritarian type of administration, in those days everyone still idealized the military principles of organization. The prevailing idea was that, quote, the 20th century would be the century of rational organization, end quote. While even some party leaders were inclined to believe that it would assume an increasingly machine-like, faceless character. In any case, the principle of state planning was treated as absolute, and the importance of natural market relations was underestimated. In practice, all writers most likely took as their point of departure the experience of war communism, as if they had decided that their aim was to construct and introduce an ideal administrative model without giving any special thought to human individuality. Even such outstanding specialists as A.V. Chayanov and N.D. Kondratev were statists, and everyone saw leadership by the party as the force which could best embody their ideas. In an atmosphere like that, war communism was able to get its second wind. Wikipedia says Alexander Chayanov lived from 1888 to 1937 and was a Russian, then Soviet agrarian economist, scholar of rural sociology, and advocate of agrarianism and cooperatives. Nikolai Kondratyev lived from 1892 to 1938 and was a Russian-Soviet economist and proponent of the new economic policy, best known for the business cycle theory known as Kondratiev waves. Kondratiev became an early leading figure of Soviet economics and promoted the NEP system of small, private, free market enterprises in the Soviet Union. Kondratiev's theory that Western capitalist economies have long-term 50 to 60-year cycles of boom followed by depression gained recognition inside and outside the Soviet Union. Kondratiev was condemned and imprisoned in 1930, but continued to work until his execution during the Great Purge in 1938. Some of his work was published for the first time posthumously. Back to the text. Trotsky took out against this background not only the breadth of his views, Trotsky stood out against this background not only by the breadth of his views. Unlike the specialist in administrative theory, as early as 1926, Trotsky perceived that the partocracy might turn their ideas into something absolutely opposite, that the mobilization model of economic development might in their hands become an instrument for ruining the economy. In the past, Trotsky had believed in the possibility that the idea of world revolution might be realized during his lifetime. That belief determined the social code of his conduct. In the course of Trotsky's political journey, the symbols of that belief changed. The people, the proletariat, technocratic administration, the man of the new culture. But what stayed unchanged was his conviction that his personal aim could be translated into attainable ideals for the future. Trotsky's powerful instinct for life enabled Trotsky to escape for almost a decade from the Comintern terrorists. Only, it would seem, the incredible exaltation of Stalin, the failure of the revolution in Spain, and the approach of a new world war, which held no promise of world revolution, brought about a weakening of that instinct. Reality fitted less and less into the all-embracing formula, quote, history means the class struggle, end quote. In the last years of his life, Trotsky appears as a man oppressed by the general lassitude of democracy, which was incapable of resisting fascism. Trotsky probably felt even more keenly that he was a general without an army. It was under the influence of such moods that Trotsky wrote his, quote, testament. It would seem that it was not illness, but the intransigence of a revolutionary that made Trotsky write those words about suicide. Trotsky's former heightened sense of danger now began from the sense of futility to weaken, and this eventually eased the task of Ramon Mercader. Trotsky's departure into physical non-existence expressed the fading of the spirit of the Russian Revolution. For the words, quote, Great October, had already become no more than an incantation by the, quote, priests of the Marxist pariah, end quote, and an object for purely ritual worship by the masses. Today, however, it is clear that Trotsky's basic ideas were merely ahead of his time. Quote, we consider, and we still consider, end quote, he wrote in March 1927, quote, that the United States of Europe and our Soviet Union will join together in one economic whole. We said, the Soviet Union was a gigantic bridge between a socialist federation of Europe and a federation of Asia, an interchange of values, is a necessary condition of economic progress, end quote. These words epitomize the humanistic spirit of October and its true perspectives. The end. Thank you for listening.